And they left their nets and followed Jesus. Pretty heroic to be called like that and then just to leave. I mean, these fellas were professional fishermen. That was their job. They had their boats. They were part of families. And so you would suspect that they would be staying there. But Jesus' call to them was such that heroically they left their livelihood and followed the Lord to be fishers of people. I mean, it's awesome to have stories like this, but I think we have to be careful to balance it in other ways too, because, not everybody is asked to follow the Lord heroically. Everybody's asked to follow the Lord, but not necessarily heroically. Last week we reflected on the church in Corinth, where people pretty much stayed. It was a local church, and they were called to by various people to follow Christ. And it might not have been heroic, but it still had to infiltrate every phase of their life. That they would be, as we heard in the first reading in the gospel, a light in darkness, like Christ was. A hope, working for unity and peace in the midst of a very, very diverse world. And it is a diverse world, and it was back then. As you heard, some of the people in Corinth were called by Paul, some by Peter, some by Christ, they claimed, right directly. And it was good, but except what had happened is word came back to Paul, who had lived in Corinth for over a year. Now they're bickering. I came from Paul, I came from Cephas. My call's better than your call, kind of thing. And that's when he got down to the nitty-gritty and said, you're forgetting we're all followers of Christ Jesus. Divisions and competition were winning over cooperation. And of course that happens around us today, doesn't it? Today as we've got a new president inaugurated just 2 days ago, President Trump, and a third of the Senate and all of the Congress, it's all new in one sense. But boy, oh boy, discord and competition, it's like the new normal. That's what you do. You take sides and you go after the other. And we're all involved in it. I mean, I think the only way you could escape this is if you wore earplugs, blinders, never went out of the house, and never looked at a newspaper, turned on your TV, or listened to any or watched any media. That would be about the only way. Otherwise, every one of us is affected by it. And so the question is, what's the Christian position in all of this? How do we get through the maze of the competition and the name-calling and all of that's there? I suspect that almost everybody here is either would identify or say, I lean toward being a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian or a Green or one or the other smaller groups. And that's good. This diversity among us can be fitting, and the fact that we take positions, that we work on some piece of legislation, that we talk an issue up, that is good, that's healthy. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We're not isolated. And, we're following a Christian way when we do that. Christ was just not all milquetoast. I mean, when he saw religious leaders, scribes and Pharisees, who were jealous of their position, those whole series in the Gospels, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, he went after them. They had crossed the line. And you heard how Paul went after the people he loved deeply and said, how can you have those divisions among you? And even our Pope Francis, he can be so gentle, and he's reaching out to those on the edge But boy, if he sees anybody in the church, especially in positions of authority, that are milking it, that are using it for themselves, he uses very strong language to shake them up. So somehow that can be healthy. And what we're asked to be is a source of light, not having no diversity, but rather than it being damning others, that it brings people in dialogue and respect to each other. And that's what it means to be a disciple. And folks, you know and I know that's not easy. It takes faith to do it. You know, this past week I went to the movie Silence. Whew, is it powerful. It takes place in the 1600s, and it's when there was a great persecution of the small Christian community in Japan. And a terrible, terrible time. The Christians had to live in hiding. And there was rumors, the Jesuits were the ones that had brought Christ there. There was rumors that one of the few remaining priests had been tortured and had denied his faith and was no longer nurturing the hidden Christian community. Two of the younger generations who considered this guy his mentor, their mentor, couldn't believe it. And so they persuaded the provincial to let them go to Japan and see if they could find him and see what the truth was. So finally the provincial gave in, and they took a small craft and made it to the shores of Japan. Of course, they were European, so they didn't look at all like the natives. And so very shortly, when people started seeing them, the small Christian cells that were living in hiding found them. And they became a light to those people. They became a source of hope, and they celebrated the Eucharist. And it was beautiful for a while. But then they were found out. And then that's when the nets of the people in authority started closing in. And they were arrested. They were separated. And then they witnessed torture of themselves and of the people that they were trying to be a light to. And it became extremely painful. They saw physical torture, they saw Christians being killed, and then the psychological torture was added. And it came to that point where, well, you know, if you denied Christ, you guys, all these little people that are being tortured, they won't be killed. So why don't you just leave your way of life? All through that movie, it's called Silence, and it's just silent the entire time. All through that time, all I could think of, Paul, how little your faith is, how weak it can be. How would you live then? It's easy to preach, Paul, but how would you live it under those circumstances? And I think it's a great question for me, and it's a great question for every one of us, because we might not be tortured, but we're challenged. Light of Christ in the darkness. How do we live it out today?